Will be in a minute here. Good morning, everybody. My name is Peter Jensen. I'm going to be your moderator for today's session. Just a couple of administrative announcements before we actually start. First of all, in the event of a fire alarm, we would exit through these two exit doors here, go out the main door of the lobby here, and then go down to the end of the amber grill, at which time we will be out of the way of any fire or other emergency response vehicles. This session is going to be recorded, and the slides and other documents will be available. So please, rather than take off and try to get a fuzzy picture of whatever you want, you'll be able to download that information in approximately a week ago or a week from now at our site. Our presenter this morning is Mike Engleson from Wisconsin Lakes, a man who needs no introduction, but we're going to introduce him anyway. Mike is probably one of the most knowledgeable people that we have in the state of Wisconsin regarding budget matters, policy decisions, and various other legislative activities regarding Wisconsin lakes and rivers. And we're very glad to have him here to update us. As part one of the session, there will be a break, and then we'll have part two where we'll talk about some of the legislation that's out there. But we're going to start off with the financial aspects of our budget in the Wisconsin Legislature. And I will turn it over to Mike. Go ahead.
Thank you, Peter. Everybody hear me okay? Is the mic working good? Got good marks in the back. So welcome to everybody watching online. Hopefully you're curled up still in your PJs on a Friday morning, like everybody else in the room is. And thank you for the introduction. That might have been a slight overstatement. I don't know if I would call myself the premier knowledge base on these issues, but I'll do my best to fill you in. Just to be clear too, I noticed in the agenda, I think the title that I copy and pasted over to Sarah left out the word budget. So it was just, this won't be a general introduction as Peter kind of indicated. This session, this first hour, I'm just going to talk about what's going on with the state budget because it is a budget year. And then after the break, we'll cover general legislation. Another caveat that you'll find in all of this is that there isn't a whole lot going on. That was the case last year too. The legislature is really focused on other things and they haven't spent a lot of time on conservation issues. So as different than in past years when there have been, big omnibus bills that have when moving to change everything, there's not a whole lot of that going on this year. And over the sessions, we'll talk a little bit about why that might be. So one of the things that I wanted to do, and I always like to do with these sessions, is spend some time on process, because I think it's really important for everyone to get a good grounding on how these things happen just as much as what actually is out there. And this, with not a ton of stuff going on, this is a good year probably to do that. So we're going to spend the first part of this kind of diving deep into what the budget process looks like, so that when if you have an issue that is budget related, sort of when you can insert yourself into the process and how that might look, because it's a much longer, more complicated process than you probably realize, unless you've heard me give this talk before. And then we'll get into what's happening in the budget and a little bit about how you can influence it. But before we do that, for those of you who don't know, I'm the executive director of Wisconsin Lakes. We are the statewide nonprofit association of lake organizations and a conservation organization. So we have both organizational and individual members. We promote healthy lakes. We provide educational and technical assistance to lake organizations. We advocate for sound science-based water policy and work with regional and statewide partners. We can't do that without your support. So thank you to those of you who are members and donors. If you're not, I invite you to visit our website and check us out. Pitch done. So I'll start with the timeline because it's good to know when things happen over the course of the legislature. So the legislature sits for 2 years. We had the elections last November, so a new legislature came in on January 1st. So you can see we're right there. That's roughly March-ish, right? Most of the work that happens right now is on the budget. That's the big bill that has to be passed. A lot of caveats on that has to be passed by the end of June. That's when the state fiscal year ends. So a lot of emphasis is put on budget work right now. There are bills being introduced, though I didn't go back and look exactly at the numbers, but I don't feel like the number of other bills that are being introduced is quite at the rate that it has been in the past. Next session, I'll talk about why I think that might be. But it's in terms of understanding the process of how this all works, it's important to understand there's kind of the budget and then there's everything else. So because the budget is the massive bill that covers most of the legislation that deals with how the state spends or raises money, it has different procedures than, you know, a regular old bill. There are some other bills that get introduced during the session that maybe appropriate some funds that are considered appropriation bills. So that is in keeping with the budget, but the budget is the one that has a wholly different process from pretty much anything else. It's structurally, fundamentally, it's the same, but just because it involves, it's so big, there's a streamlined process that it helps it work through both houses at the same time. You'll see what I'm talking about. So sometimes the budget is not passed by the end of the fiscal year. I think the longest it's ever gone out has been to the end of the odd numbered year in which the budget has to be passed. If that happens, Wisconsin is not like the federal government. Think government does not shut down. There are statutory provisions that just allow current spending rates to continue at the same pace. So there is not this pressure of we have to pass continuing resolutions or things like that that you see with the federal government. Generally, the legislature has been pretty good over the last 4 or 5 cycles of trying to get something done by the end of the fiscal year. So we haven't had that happen in a while, but you never know. And we have the legislature has a slightly new flavor to it this year because the elections from last fall were under the new map structure. So there's a little more pressure within districts where the base is maybe less important than it was in the past to getting reelected. So we assume that people will move slightly more towards the middle. We can argue whether or not we've seen any evidence of that happening yet, but we'll see how that plays out. So there are basically 3 or 4 steps, and I'll go into each of these in a little more depth. In February, the governor proposes a budget. That's sort of the end of a process that started maybe 9 months earlier than that. Once the governor proposes his budget, there's always an address to the whole legislature. The bill gets introduced. It goes to the Joint Finance Committee. We always call it the Joint Finance Committee. I think it's officially called the Joint Committee on Finance, but I don't know anybody that doesn't use JFC. So I always say it, if you hear the 2 terms, it's the same. Once it goes through that process, which is probably the most important part of the whole process, it passes from the committee onto the full legislature. The full legislature has to vote on the same. So both the Assembly and the Senate have to agree on language. Then it goes to the governor. The governor can either sign veto, or partially veto, and we'll talk about that partial veto in a little bit. So the process starts with the governor's introduction. That actually begins when all of the executive agencies, so DNR and DATCAP and all those sorts of entities, submit budget requests. They start thinking about that. They'll start thinking about that probably in January, February, March of next year. Usually the requests have to be in, I think, sometime in the summer, and which gives the governor's office time to then put together the budget. What an agency requests is not always what ends up in the executive budget. The governor's office has control over what it's going to submit to the legislature as a proposal. Sometimes the governor will tell an agency or tell agencies in general, we're in bad financial times right now, and so the state revenues are looking down. We're going to have to cut across the board 5-10%, something like that. So there's a bit of interplay between the governor's office and the agencies. I say that because one step in the process that you can insert yourself in is start talking to DNR about, or whatever agency it might be, about things that you would like to see. You may be able to get the agency to include that in a budget request, but even if the agency says, yes, that's a really great idea, it might not get through the governor's vetting process, might get changed. Sometimes asks get increased. But if you want to do that, you need to be thinking about that almost a full year and a half in advance of what actually, when the budget actually begins. And you can see that here. So the time when the budget requests actually come just before the elections. So in 2026, there will be a midterm election. The governor is up for re-election. The agencies have submitted to the governor up through that year. If there's an election and the governor's seat flips, suddenly completely new priorities come into play. All of those agency requests, they may end up being asked to revise them somewhat, but you can see how when a new governor comes in, they already have some information about what the agencies say they would like, but obviously the policy can change a whole lot. And that new administration really only has like a month to put together what they want to have in their bill. So we saw that when Governor Evers first came into office after Governor Walker, where there was a very quick change, and they had to come up with their first budget. So covered that first bullet. The second bullet, then the governor introduces the bill to the legislature in late February, early March. Governor Evers gave a big talk. That's when what's called the executive budget, because it's the budget that comes from the governor, the executive, is introduced. And this year it was given the bill number of Assembly Bill 50 and Senate Bill 45. So procedurally, when a bill is introduced, it's introduced into both the Senate and the Assembly in most cases, definitely in the case of the budget. And it just means this is the 50th bill that was introduced in the Assembly at that time. There's nothing magical about any of those numbers. But if you hear legislators talking about AB 50 or SB 45, they're talking about the budget. Any questions up to this point? All right. Okay. Now we get into the fun part, which is the Joint Finance Committee. So Joint Finance it's a statutory committee. It exists perpetually. It's not a committee that's recreated by each new session of the legislature. It has 16 members, 8 from the Senate, 8 from the Assembly, and each house membership is weighted by the majority party. So Republicans control both houses of the legislature right now. That means there's 6 Republicans from the Assembly, 6 senators, 2 Democrats from each house in the committee right now. Its primary responsibility is to work with the bills that factor in money issues. So that is mostly the budget. As I said, there are other bills that will come up. They have some. The committee has some other functions that it does as well. Potentially underlying all this is a question of what counts as an appropriation bill. So I don't know a whole lot about this because I just heard about this literally a couple of days ago, but apparently there's a lawsuit that has been is working its way through the courts. I'm not sure if it's been accepted by the Supreme Court yet or not, but sort of ask the question of what counts as an appropriations bill. We'll get into an example of why that's important. Obviously, if the bill says we'll appropriate $500,000 from the general fund to go to the surface water grant program, that's an appropriation. If it's a bill that says that there's going to be a program that's created that's funded by some particular like licensing fees or something like that, is that an appropriation or not? If it's a bill that implements the spending, does activities from which appropriated money is going to be spent, does that count as an appropriation bill? That's kind of a big question because it implicates whether joint finance gets involved is one reason why that would be big. So here are the members of the committee, and you can see it's heavily weighted as you would expect in terms of Republicans. I used the contemporary traditional red and blue designation. So mostly Republican controlled. The majority party gets to set, when they control both houses, really has huge control over what goes into the bill that eventually goes to the full legislature. If the houses are split, so I'll get to you in a second. If the houses are split, so you have Senate Republican control, Assembly Democrat control, all of a sudden those colors would even out and you have a much different process, right? Because you have basically an evenly split committee. There's a lot more compromise and horse trading that has to go on to get something passed out of that kind of a committee than when you have all one party control. Mike, you had a question? So the online people can hear the question he's gonna.
Where is it established that it's 6-2? To me, it makes more sense that it should be prorated by the number of Republican and Democratic senators and legislators, because it's not quite this skewed now.
Yeah, I see what you're
It's a
saying.
lot more balanced. So
Yep.
shouldn't the committee be more balanced?
I am not sure if that is a statutory, if that's by statute that it's split that way, or if that's, yeah, if it's not statutory, the majority party sets the rules for how committee assignments occur. And so because the majority still is the majority, the Republicans would get to decide how those committees are made up. I'm willing to bet, though, I can try to find that out, but I'm willing to bet that in the case of finance, that may be a statutory decision. So the first thing that any committee that gets legislation holds public hearings on the legislation, and the budget is no different. Joint finance traditionally holds some number of public hearings, usually all around the state. Most bills only have hearings at the Capitol. The budget, they will collect public testimony all over the place. So those hearings did get noticed. I believe those came out last week. So they're all in April: Kaukauna, West Allis, Hayward, and Wausau. They run all day, so from 10 to 5 in this case. I think The legislature likes to, it's up to the chairs of the committee whether they go over 5 o'clock, but they're usually pretty, starts at 10, it ends at 5. Well, I'll editorialize. It's the legislature. It might not start at 10. Usually people are given a time frame because these are heavily attended. You'll often have somebody that has a particular issue that, that gets a busload of people to come. And so there's 50 people that are all testifying on the same issue. So you're limited to a certain amount of time to testify. That's not always the case in a smaller bill that doesn't have as many people coming to testify. You can write in testimony, so you can send testimony to the committee. And if you just Google Joint Finance Committee, you'll find the notice for these hearings. You also get there through the legislature's website. You'll find the notice for the hearings, and it has an address that you can send your written comments in. You can also go to the hearing and submit written comments. You don't have to testify necessarily. And you can also watch them on Wisconsin Eye, which if you're not familiar with, that's a internet broadcast. I think it's on Spectrum Cable still. But it's a stream of many things that happen at the Capitol. So a lot of hearings get played on Wisconsin Eye, and it's a great way to keep up with stuff if you're a policy wonk and want to watch 6-hour hearings on things. Or you can fast forward too, because it's recorded. So I've done that on occasion. I've been asked, are these worth going to and testifying at? And my answer is, I'm kind of like, if there are 300 people that are testifying and 256 of them are testifying on school choice, and you're the one person that is testifying about money for cover crops, I'm not really, I don't know. Maybe you actually get heard more than the other people because you're actually something different and their ears will perk up. But issues can get drowned out on these just by the happenstance of who shows up. So it's definitely, I don't believe that they are the most effective way. I'm not sure they're any less effective than anything else. The best thing to do is to contact legislators directly. I think written comments probably can carry as much weight. I don't know how this committee is running right now. Sometimes in the past, it's been, they get a lot of communications about the budget, but they'll start a spreadsheet and tick off how many comments they've gotten on a particular issue. And that leads to some understanding of what the public is thinking about things. But this is at least is a way. It also can help if you have an issue and you do have a lot of people that can show up to one of these things. It gets press attention. There are other benefits beyond just going there and thinking that the committee is really going to hear what you're saying. Yeah.
The written testimony, is it read at the meeting or is it just copied into the committee members?
It's just copied in. Mostly because it's not, I don't even think if you submitted it at the hearing, I don't think anybody they would save the time for the people that are there. So, but then all of that information, anytime if you can do both too, by the way. So you can go and you can say, I want my 3 minutes, but I've also prepared this 2-page sheet. That goes into a formal record that is then available online. So other people can go and can read through all of that. Anything else before I go on? Beyond those initial public hearings, there's one other time when the committee will do public hearings. They could schedule additional hearings too if they want to. The committee chairs have authority to hold as many hearings as they want to in as many places as they want to. But they also invite all of the heads of the different executive agencies to come in and talk about their portion of the budget. So the budget is actually divided up by subject matter. So there is an agriculture section, there is a natural resources section. If you just look at the code of the bill, it's not necessarily laid out that way, but there, as I'll talk about in a minute, there's a number of different places where you can find information, sort of explanatory memos, and it's the committee takes it in chunks. So they'll have there's been one hearing scheduled so far. So on April 1st, someone from the UW system will be testifying, and some folks from the Department of Corrections will be testifying. They'll eventually have a hearing where DNR, DATCAP, those sorts of entities will testify. So that's all a process of gathering information, giving a chance for the public to at least express their opinion on what's going to go into this giant spending bill. Then comes the process where the committee has to decide what actually is going in there and is going to get forwarded to the legislature. So they have a starting place, which is the budget that the governor has provided, or what we call the base budget, which is, I find it's a little hard to, it's a little hard to explain. The base budget is sort of just very loosely put what we've typically spent on stuff in the past, like year after year after year. So every budget will have numbers that that have traditionally been spent, but there might be an additional amount spent on something. So county conservation staffing dollars is a good example of that. There's like a floor that pretty much you can expect every budget is going to have. And then every budget will have some additional amount that's put in on that. Now, there's not like some document that where you can go and you can say, this is the base budget. Like I can look it up and find out what that number is. And like that number might change over time too. But it's often indicated in the bill if it's a change. So if it'll be indicated as this is a 1 or a 2-year appropriation, as opposed to this is a continuing appropriation. If it's a continuing appropriation, then it's probably considered the base budget. So you've got your base budget, you've got what the governor has proposed, which is, I'll talk about in a second, is significantly more than what the base budget is. The committee is not required to follow what the governor has proposed. They can take those numbers and just completely ignore them, which is in part what has happened probably the last 3 budget cycles. And what we anticipate probably is going to happen this session as well. So after all the public hearings are over, the committee will start with executive sessions. And as I said, they'll take them in chunks based on issue. So there will be a motion that will cover what is going to go into the bill for natural resources. It will remove the stuff from the bill that the governor proposed that they don't like, and insert new stuff in that they would like to at least debate as a committee. And when I say they, in general, it's whoever is controlling the committee. So in this case, currently, it would be the Republican majority. The committee then will debate back and forth. Sometimes there are multiple options that are provided as to how they could appropriate particular things. Amounts will get changed, and there'll be a lot of back and forth on what goes into that final motion. Then that motion is passed and they are done with natural resources. So at the very end of the motion process, they'll have 1 or 2 omnibus motions that will make additional corrections, and those will cover, those are sort of potpourris of whatever issue. So there might be some additional changes to the natural resources. For instance, an example of that in 2015, in that very last motion contained the language that stripped local control for shoreline zoning from counties. That happened in that very last motion of the budget. It was not something that had been discussed ever in the past in any of the previous public hearings. It wasn't in, at that time, Republican Governor Walker's budget. it kind of came out of nowhere. Yeah. Oh, go ahead and ask the question and I'll repeat it for. Yes. Excellent question. Actually, the next thing I was going to talk about. So perfect lead in. So the question was, what about things that are not financially related, that are not appropriations, so policy versus budget items? From the beginning of Wisconsin as a state, when we have started passing state budgets, budgets have typically been chock full of things that had nothing to do with spending. So lots of policy issues. Republicans, Democrats, whatever party was in control, everyone always used the budget to get a lot of stuff in. And why would you do that? One reason is that the budget is such a huge bill and it's so important because it controls funding for a lot of things that people want funded, that if it doesn't pass, those things don't get money. And so there's a lot of pressure to get a budget passed. It's the budget. Like, we need the budget to operate, right? So if you put like a controversial, but maybe not hugely, it's something that is like really within the popular debate into the budget, it's really easy to get it through because everybody has to vote for the bill. Shoreline zoning is an example of that again, in that there were a number of Republicans that really didn't like that provision being in. They probably would not have voted for that had it been a standalone bill, but it got put in to the budget and they felt pressure and need to vote for the budget, so it went through and became law. Since that budget, the Republican majority has been pretty militant about not allowing policy stuff to be in there. So one of the things that they do with the governor's bill, they'll have I forget if it's Legislative Reference Bureau or Fiscal Bureau, but one of the legislative support entities will go through and list all the things that are not fiscally related that are in the bill, and pretty much all of that stuff has been stripped out. Pretty much when members of the majority have suggested adding in things that are not fiscally related, they have been kept out of the budget, which, for the reason I stated before, I actually think that makes a lot of sense. It's just, we have gotten bad policy in the state, and I think people that would be on the maybe flip side of the ideological spectrum from me would say, we have gotten a lot of bad policy in the state because of that process. And it's just, I would much rather have bills policy be enacted in a way that the policy gets fully debated rather than slipped into a bill in the metaphorical dark of night. How's that? I had another point to that, which flew out of my head because it's early on the last day of convention, so it'll come to me eventually. Eventually, all of those motions will have been completed and the committee will be ready to send a bill to the full legislature. And once that happens, the legislature then can take over and start debating and has the power to change everything again if it should wish. So the bill is introduced in both the Senate and the Assembly as the Joint Finance Committee has changed the governor's bill. So if it's been completely rewritten, the new bill that the committee has passed goes to the Senate Assembly. It's often amended. There are always things that happen, and these usually end up being like late night sessions. The budget is something where it often is will be a go until 3 a.m. kind of thing for legislators. Maybe not so much the last couple of budgets because the leadership has been pretty tight in controlling what people will vote for in the majority party. That what comes out of joint finance is what the legislative leadership wants as well. And so rank and file pretty much fall in line, and it can skate through a little more quickly, which I think is why we've seen it actually pass before the end of the fiscal year, unlike times before when the houses have been split, or maybe there's more differences within the party on what policy should be enacted. But however it's amended, all of the language has to be exactly the same in the final bill that both the Assembly and the Senate pass. So the Assembly may pass a version, the Senate may pass a version. If there are changes in amounts or wording, they need to come together and reconcile those. They can do that. They can send it back to Joint Finance or create a special reconciliation committee. There's a number of ways that they can do that, but they need to, sometimes it's just brokering between Senate and Assembly leadership, but it can't go to the governor until both bills are exactly the same. That discussion was a lot shorter than the Joint Finance discussion, and that's intentional because yes, the legislature can change things once it gets there, but the Joint Finance Committee is really the one that sets most of the playing field. It's once it gets to the legislature, it's a lot more about changing sort of the color and the flavor than it is making outright gigantic alterations. So if you're working on a budget issue and you haven't gotten it done before it gets to the floor of the Assembly, you're probably in trouble of being able to get that issue to go the way that you want it to go, because the committee holds so much power in this entire process. Any questions before we send the bill up to the governor's office? Yeah, hold on and we'll bring the mic to you.
Who decides who sits on that committee? That committee has a lot of power. So is it a big deal if you're on that committee? So just explain that process. And then through the new elections, how does it change?
So with the new elections, the process for committee selection hasn't changed at all. Republicans retain the majority in both houses, and the leadership of those houses are the ones that ultimately appoint people to different committees. So Senate leader, Republican, and Assembly leader both get to make those appointments. The minority leader for the minority party in each house gets to appoint their people to those. That's true for any committee. It's the same process. Yeah, I would say being on joint. So the question was, is being on Joint Finance a big deal? And it's probably beyond being part of the leadership team for each house, that is probably the biggest deal committee in the legislature. Because it's such a powerful committee. So we passed the bill. It goes back to the governor. And at this point, the governor, as I mentioned earlier, has three options. First one's pretty simple. He says, yep, everything that's in there is perfectly fine with me, or at least I can swallow it enough. We got to get it passed. I've signed the bill, and the budget just becomes law as it made it through the legislature. Second one is a little more complicated. The governor can veto the bill in full. So say, I don't like anything in here. This thing is so horrible that I am just going to say no to the entire thing, whatever the consequences. At that point, the bill goes back to the legislature. They can either just start over and like build a whole new bill again. If it's very clear that there are so many disagreements with the governor that it's not going to get signed, that might be the case. Or if they have a 2/3 majority in each house, they can pass an override, and then the bill passes as they originally sent it to the governor. but they have to have a supermajority in both the Assembly and the Senate for that to happen. The third option for the governor, and this is pretty unique in the country, not all states have this. I'm not sure how many others do. But the governor has the power to veto parts of a bill, of the budget bill, and any bill that includes appropriations. So I talked about that distinction between general policy legislation and appropriations bills. The governor can wipe out pieces of that appropriations bill, but not the general policy bill. I'll explain that, the nuances of that in a second, but again, the bill goes back to the legislature. Those partial vetoes can be overridden in whole or in part, so they can override just some of those partial vetoes, and the governor will send a report with all of the specific provisions that were vetoed. They can override those, and then the budget becomes law as whatever form it is after those overrides. Or they can do nothing, and the bill becomes law as it was partially vetoed by the governor. So if you search Wisconsin Legislative Fiscal Bureau partial veto power in Wisconsin, you should get all this information in a nicely laid out document that's more readable than this. But I will point out the highlights of this. Do I have a clicker? They do. An important piece is that if it's an appropriation bill, non-appropriation parts of that can still be vetoed. So we talked about that they try to strip out policy from the budget as much as possible. You can't strip out everything because sometimes an appropriation has pieces that like have to be in there, otherwise there's nothing that you can really do with that money. So there's functional policy, non-money related things that relate to the implementation of those appropriations. If it's an appropriation bill, the governor can still use the partial veto power on those parts. It's not just the dollar figures, it's the words and the sentences that he or she has the control over. An example of where that, I'll get to your question in a second.
A question here regarding the, where was that? Entire words or individual digits may be stricken. If there's a line item that says $100,000 allocated to X, could the governor strike out 10 and make it 10,000?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
And in fact, there was in the last budget, I'm going to get this wrong because I just remembered this and didn't look it up. So don't quote me for accuracy on this. But there was a bill that gave funding to, it had something to do with school funding. It was for just a couple of years, and the governor struck a line that ended up making it perpetual. So it was like 450 years of funding, and people were like, the governor has created like which, you know, that can get changed just by another budget, right? So it's not like it actually is, once that happens, that it's written in stone that for one forever that would be the case. But it's an example of how that power can be used. There's another example. Governor Doyle had a budget where at that time, it wasn't a word or a line item, it was a letter item where you could actually strike letters within words. And it was one of the most masterful, I don't know who did it, but like they took a whole long section, struck out individual letters to string together new words. And it was like, it was still, I can't remember what the topic was, but it created an entirely new thing. It wasn't even close to what the legislature had put in there. That kind of got people a little like, okay, this is a little over the top. So there was a constitutional amendment that was passed that reduced the power so that it's just a a line and word veto. Back to the appropriation, non-appropriation part though, another example of where this became important was in the last budget. The legislature appropriated a significant amount of money towards PFAS regulations. So PFAS are forever chemicals, the emerging pollutants. And there was money that was allocated, but there was no indication in the budget of how that money was going to be spent. And then there was a bill that was introduced later that was about how that money could be spent. The reason they did that was because if they had put all of the, and again, this is the majority party, the reason the majority party did not put that how to be spent language in the budget was because the governor could have changed it by keeping that out of the budget. It's a policy, arguably, it's a policy only bill. And so then the governor has to either accept what is in that bill or not. So it's an example of how this power can create sort of some political games that go on that might be confusing as to why things are done in that way in the first place. Any other questions on this? Yeah, we'll go blue shirt and then.
So in the case of that PFAS, so the money's allocated, but there's no policy of how it's going to be spent.
Mm-hmm.
If that policy of how it's going to be spent is not passed, then the money just sits in the budget.
Yes, so it's still sitting there. I think I'm actually not 100% sure on this, but I'm pretty sure that if it's not spent, that it can be reallocated in the next budget, but it's not like the allocation goes away at the end of the fiscal year. The money would have to be spent by the end of that fiscal year. Sometimes there's money that's not spent by an agency or something that's left over that will either the next budget or there will be a bill that will sort of fold that money back into if there's a structural deficit in a fund or in the agency. So that money ends up getting spent, but not for that purpose. We see that with some stuff in DNR. Skip?
Mike, years ago on this partial veto, line item veto, governors were able to add words, add numbers, but with this recent change, are they able to add things or can they
No.
just remove things?
No, you can't increase appropriations and you can't add words. You can create new sentences by selectively deleting words. Again, there's got to be like a school where people go to, right, to learn how to do this, because I mean it's very creative. So, any other questions before I move on? I do actually before the end of this want to get to what's actually might be in this budget. If you want to learn more, there are a lot of documents online. So the legislature's website's a great place to learn about all things legislature related. There's lots of information on there. There's a section where you can click on to get to current legislation. You can get to the budget bill from there. The Department of Administration puts out budget papers that sort of summarize what the governor's budget says. They come in a couple of different forms. The governor puts something out that talks about, he kind of groups things together in specific areas, so like childcare or healthcare, education. There are other papers that will group things together differently, and sometimes it's hard to cross-reference. Is this bullet point in this document talking about this in this document? But you can get as deep into the weeds as you want to. Eventually, the Legislative Fiscal Bureau, which is a statutorily created entity that supports the legislature on doing research on fiscal matters, they will put out papers on each different section of the budget explaining background, the options. Those are really informative. We're asking legislators, if you're a new legislator that's coming in, you've first entered the Capitol and got in your office in January, 2 months later, you're expected to know everything there is to know about all aspects of state government and how the spending works. That's a lot, right? So there's a lot of informational papers that are publicly available that can help you learn more about how DNR exactly is funded, and things like that. And the Fiscal Bureau papers are related specifically to the budget that is happening right now. If you Google Legislative Fiscal Bureau papers, you'll find the page. I checked last night and they had not released any for this budget yet. I anticipate those will be coming out probably in the next couple of weeks. So we have a question back there.
Is there a website that you'd recommend that would summarize the actions like West Politics, or does your association keep track of certain bills so that we would have an abbreviated form to monitor besides monitoring all the Fiscal Bureau white papers and things like that?
Yeah. For specific, especially for the budget, for specific issues, it's probably best to check, we put stuff out, other conservation organizations put stuff out. So like if you're interested in the stewardship fund, Gathering Waters has a great page on the Nelson stewardship fund. There isn't a really good comprehensive citizens level and news reporting on it too. Like you kind of have to dig it out yourself from various places. Obviously, we're concerned with water and lake issues, so that's primarily what we talk about. Other places will talk about other things. So, yeah.
I'll say that the the Wheeler report, it's not specific to individual issues, but if you're looking broadly at what's going on in the state government, going to the Wheeler report, signing up for their services can be a good way of following and tracking information. And I think they've started introducing some ability to track certain issues or committees as well.
Sure. That's a good point. So Wheeler and I think you mentioned Wiz Politics. Those are websites you'll get they will repost press releases that come out from various organizations that talk about things, and they all offer some tracking tools. The legislature offers a tracking tool as well that you can subscribe to through its website, where you'll get updates, procedural updates to different bills. I'll talk more about that at the end of the next session, maybe. I'm running out of time, so I want to make sure that I get through.
Mike, one quick one.
Yeah.
On a procedural standpoint, the senators are putting together a bill on the wake enhancement restrictions. Last year, they put it, a very, poorly written one together. It went nowhere. This year, I believe it's being drafted, but who's involved in the drafting? Is it just, say, the boating manufacturers, or
Sure.
do we not know? who's involved?
That was a nice tease for my next session. I'll talk about that next time, but it's not a fiscal issue, so it's not in the budget.
Stay tuned.
So yeah, I mean, you always lead the thing that people want to hear most for last, right? Because then that's how you keep coming up next. So the governor, I think this year, knowing that the legislature was likely to not use most of what he was going to propose, in my opinion, pretty much decided, let's just throw everything in there and see what sticks, because there was a lot of pretty aggressive spending in the governor's proposal. Oftentimes things that I think probably are warranted, but I don't know if I think that they will make it through the joint finance process. One important thing to most of us in this room, no change to the motorboat gas tax. formula and the way the water resources account of DNR is funded. For those of you who don't know, surface water grants and DNR staffing and most of the way that lakes and river section people are paid is through the water resources account, and a large portion of that funds comes from what's called the motorboat gas tax. It's a carve out of the general fuel tax that we pay when we go to the pump. The idea being that, well, motorboats use gas, they go to a pump, so part of it should go towards maintaining the places that motorboats are going to operate, right? So there was no changes there, and I haven't heard anything from the Republican majority that is anything that's going to be touched at all. There are a bunch of just a potpourri of things. Want to talk more about the few other things in larger detail, but producer-led council grant funding, comprehensive PFAS programming. A lot of that is policy, not appropriation. That whole discussion we just had. Increases in some fees. So for CAFOs, for high capacity wells, things like that was all in there. Improvements to the well compensation program. If you have a well and it gets a private well and it gets contaminated, you can get grant money to help abate that problem. Bonding for non-point source water pollution. There are a number of other things that are in there. But issues that Wisconsin Lakes has identified in the budget process is important to us include the Knowles Nelson Stewardship Program. So that's a program that provides money for the state or for other entities to purchase land for conservation purposes. That whole fund, which has been very successful over the years, is up for reauthorization. So the governor's budget would reauthorize it and provide $100 million of annual funding over 10 years. There might be some shifts in exactly what goes to land acquisition and what goes to land management within that whole scheme. But we would agree that stewardship program is important for lakes, in that a number of lake organizations, especially some districts, have used stewardship funding in order to make purchases of land that helps improve water quality by keeping it in prairie or forest rather than going into intensive agriculture or something like that. The county conservation staff funding, this is a perpetual issue in the budget. The statutes say that the budget is supposed to fund county conservation department staff up to a certain level. It's never met that level. This budget would increase that amount, again, not probably to the amount that the county conservation departments through Wisconsin Land and Water have asked for, have said that this would be an amount that's full funding, but it does increase it, but still not complete. The budget would provide money for municipalities to improve both storage and the equipment that they use for road salt application. That's really important to water quality. The overuse or misuse of road salts can cause a lot of pollution problems. We've seen salination rates increasing. And so this is something based on some grant programs that have been implemented in other parts of the country. If you're interested in learning more about this, go to Wisconsin Saltwise. That's an organization working on the use of road salts in the state. And then lastly, there's some money for wild rice stewardship. We learned a little bit about Mahnomen yesterday and its importance culturally and nutritionally and environmentally to the state. And so this would provide additional funds that the state would use on that issue. So I added a slide to this, but it didn't show up. So I had a slide that talked about how to get involved. I'll run through those quickly, and this will be the same that I'll talk about at the end of the next session. There were those public hearings that I talked about earlier. Definitely get to know your legislators, contact your legislators. Even if your own legislators are not on the Joint Finance Committee, they still have some influence. If they hear that their constituents are saying, we need funding for this, that can bubble up into the full discussion within their party. Excuse me. So it's definitely worth doing that. Time for one question. We'll go.
One question.
We'll go with the DNR authority and.
So, Mike, thanks. The two things. One, just a comment. So there is a significant amount of budget stuff related to PFAS, and I think it's partly an attempt to like get some of those things a little more specified that were in the bill into the budget process a little bit more. So there's, you know, positions, there's funding for monitoring and cleanup of PFAS contamination that's in the current budget bill. So if that's an issue that's important to you, the PFAS work, track that and, you know, show up and talk about that, because there is a significant amount of funding that could be allocated.
Yeah.
I don't know how it's related to the past legacy fund and things like that, but anyway, it's just something to track. And then just, I don't know if you know, or just real quick, but most people don't know that a significant amount of our state budget or expenditures is federal funding. So I don't know if you can address that. If you know what proportion generally is. This is all about general purpose revenue. The DNR, we have many positions that are federally funded positions that are not affected directly by this budget at all, but they are affected by the federal budget.
Yeah, and I don't know what that percentage is. I've asked some people and been trying to get a handle on that in general, because that creates a whole lot of uncertainty out there, right? We don't know what's happening with a lot of those federal funds, and I don't think we have a grasp of how they interrelate programmatically. So just because you're working with someone in a program that isn't federally funded doesn't mean that someone else is losing money or losing a position is not going to impact. There's going to be a trickle up or trickle down effect because of that. I think that we all have to watch out for. So uplifting way to end.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Mike. We're going to take a break. We'll be back here at 15 minutes for part 2. We'll see you in a bit.